So let's continue building the app and talk more about React, the library we use on the front end to build user interfaces. The repository is this one I'll be using for the source code. And let's get started. So I already have it open here. And let me open Visual Studio Code. By the way, if you recall, all we did was cd to the web client directory and type npm start. And we did all of that after running create React app to generate the project. So you should have something like this after doing npm start. If you're downloading the repository for the first time, you have to npm install first before doing this to get all the dependencies. npm space install. Anyway, we are going to localhost :3000 in the browser. And let me put on Firefox. Sorry, on Chrome. It looks like this so far. And I'm zoomed in so you can see better. Okay, let's go to VS Code. Web client, source. If you recall, we have a generated project for the React application under web client. Previously, we had written HTML and CSS and JavaScript files in the SRC directory at the top level, but then we have now moved on to a React application. So if you want as an exercise, you could convert all of these HTML pages to React, just following the pattern we did before. Anyway, we're gonna go web client source app.js, and we have this messages component here so far that we use from the app component. So if you recall, basically in the world of React, we create what are called components. You can think of them as like our own HTML elements. And the way we create them is using a function definition. So we declare this function called app here that returns some template that looks like HTML, but it's actually something called a JSX, which is some syntactic sugar to call the React.createElement function. And then we instantiate or kind of show our messages custom element or component here that we created outside. And we just have a function definition, and we did all this previously, and then finally we return that template that we see in the browser, which is basically this. Have an H1 there, some text area, a button to submit the form that underlines that. And then we got a bunch of divs with all the messages. Now, first thing I want to show you is how to better organize your source code. And you don't have to have everything in one single file. You can actually separate your components into separate files. And that's what people usually do. So if you want to create under SRC a folder, let's call it components, you could move messages there. Let's say I create messages.js here. By the way, you might also see the extension .jsx whenever you have JSX in the source code. If you're using TypeScript, you will see .ts or .tsx. And usually we use JSX and TSX when we have some JavaScript with the JSX, basically the template that we returned from the components. But for my case here, it's very simple. I don't have to do that fancy stuff. Anyway, I'm gonna have the app open down here in this panel to the bottom. And all I have to do is take the definition for messages, the function, and I start from before the word function. I'm gonna hold Shift and press all the way till the end, the curly braces, to sort of highlight it all. And then I'm Control C. If you're using Mac, it's Command X, right? Sorry, I said Control X, not Command C. Let's go here, Control V or Command V on Mac to paste. And then in order for us to be able to use messages, this function, from another file, we have to, in the file that we need to use it, import, in this case, app.js, you're going to import messages from /component/messages. Let me disable my thing because I always forget. One moment. Reload. There you go. All right, so we first got to import some word from, you got to give the path to the file In this case, it's dot slash, which means current directory, slash components, slash messages, and it's implicit to be .js. You can omit the extension, but it's pointing to this file here, relatively from where app stands. And then from the messages.js here, you have to export the function to make it available to those who want to use it from another place or another file. So you can either do here with export default before the function, or you can do afterward if you like to separate with the same export default messages. Either way works. Now we got to fix some issues because it's complaining here. It's probably going to work, but it usually complains if you use something it doesn't know. You got to import at the top. So import React from React like that. And then we go through the code to see if there's nothing else that we need to import. And looks like no, I didn't get any Visual Studio Code hints. And then back to app.js, you can just save that as it is. By the way, we did this message CSS, so we probably want to move this importing of the style to be specifically for messages instead of app. So I'm going to move that as well. And that's how you isolate the logic to other files. Typically, people like to isolate every component, one component per file. That seems to be the norm these days. And we like to better organize with a folder like components, for example. I might also see people organizing by pages, especially people who use Next.js or frameworks on the server side for React. And that's common as well. Usually they have the file-based routing, which is a traditional Next.js, but now they have another one, the app router. But in any case, that's the refactoring or changing of the code to improve organization that I wanted to do first. Now, the next thing I want to touch upon is how can we actually retrieve the data from a server? Because if you notice, let me close app and focus on messages.js here. If you notice, we have a hard-coded list or array of objects that each represent a message or a comment that we want to show. But actually, this data is usually, in practice, comes from a server, a backend server, and that server in turn has the data stored in a database, which we'll learn in the later sessions. But for now, we got to figure it out using a fake one, a fake backend. Okay, let me just check Google Chrome to see if there's no errors here. So we got problems with the refactoring and changing the code. So that's why it's always important whenever you change your source code, you want to test it to see if it's still working. So you want to go to the browser and see if there are no problems, test the app, try to write a message, and so on. So clearly there's a problem here because if we go back to the code, I moved the import for the CSS, but now when I say dot slash, it means somewhere within components, but there's no messages.css within the components directory. So there are two ways to go about this. Either you fix the path to dot dot, which means one level up in the directory chain, or I move messages.css to actually be within components. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take drag and drop messages.css to the directory components. So they're in the same place, therefore the dot slash relative path current directory will work. Okay, let me just take some time here to post the link to people who have just come in. So we are doing the app that's from this repository. I paste the link to the Zoom chat. So if you want to follow along and don't yet have the source code, you go to this repository and clone it or download a zip, either way. And then you're gonna go cd to web client. We're gonna npm install, and then you're gonna npm start. I paste the commands to the Zoom chat. Okay, going back to what we had to do. So I want to take this. First, let's think about if you were to get the data from a server, how would you actually set it in a React application? Because if you think about it, when the user accesses your web page, they're not going to see the post yet because it needs to first get that data from a server. So you're gonna wait a little bit between not seeing anything and seeing the post. I don't know if you ever noticed that in websites today, there's often some jumps sometimes. Like you first access the website and it's loading stuff, and then out of a sudden it jumps and then the data comes along. Okay, so we're gonna use an effect here. Let's first make this. Let me take this. I'm gonna cut this array here, and I'm gonna keep it in my clipboard, and I'm gonna put it empty. So at first, we're not gonna see anything like this. And then we are gonna do something when this page is loaded. So to do that, I'm gonna use an effect from React. So we're gonna use react.useEffect here. So we're gonna do this within the function for the component in the top level here for the body of the function. But make sure you don't write it inside any of these inner functions, okay? It has to be outside. So useEffect is a hook that is gonna be calling some function or instructions repeatedly after every render. So the in React, when something changes in the state, it renders the component over again. So it's gonna trigger this function call given to useEffect. But you can also kind of calibrate that, say you only want to call this function when some other value changes. You can do that using an array of dependencies. But for now, we're just going to keep it simple. We're going to do it like this. When the component mounts, that is the first time you access the page, we're going to request the server for the data and then set the array of messages. And then after that, that was the first render and we're not going to do it anymore, just once. So in order to do the use effect only once, we have to pass an empty array of dependencies. Okay, so the arguments use effect is a function with a set of instructions that you want to do once this renders. And then the second argument will be an array of dependencies. But if you leave that empty, it will mean that I only want this function to be executed once after the first rendering of this component. And here I'm going to do the actual setting of messages to those messages. I don't have backend yet, but I'm just simulating it. And to do that, just for the sake of example, let me put a timeout here. So timeout is basically a function that will call another function that you pass after a certain number of milliseconds. So I'm going to pass a function here. And after, let me put 3 seconds, which is 3000 milliseconds. I'm going to put this inside just to simulate the backend. So what's happening? Okay, set timeout, we pass a function, and this function has some instructions that will be executed after 3 seconds. And then after 3 seconds, the function here inside will be called and will set the messages to this array of 3 objects. And because we set messages, we change the React state. The React state having changed will trigger another render of the component. And then once it hits the mapping of the messages, instead of mapping the empty ones, an empty list, it will now map all the 3 ones. So let me try in the browser. I'm going to refresh and wait 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. And you see it appeared after 3 seconds. Okay. So that's the hook, use effect. So if you want anything to happen once the component renders for the first time, you can pass the function to use effect, and the second argument to use effect has to be an empty. Some people might use effect like this, writing it without React dot. And if you want to do that, you got to go to the import and put a comma here, use effect to the kind of like import a named export there. Works the same way, okay? And you can do that same thing for use state. You might see that as well. So you write use state here, comma, use effect, and you don't have to type React dot. Okay, great. But so far I haven't talked about backend server, but I have to talk about promises first. So let's go to the browser. Open the DevTools console. By the way, there's an error here. Invalid non-property class. Did you mean class name? Let's fix that. Where is it? A div. I think I typed class equals instead of class name somewhere. Let me look for class equals. So line 48, messages.js. I should type class name because I'm using React. And let me make sure I don't have any others in app.js. Yeah, we're good. Okay, if I go back to the browser and refresh, yeah, I don't see it anymore. It's a common thing that we have to do as we switch from plain HTML to React. Okay, so let's talk about promises. Because the nature of getting or retrieving data from a backend server is asynchronous, meaning it might take some time to get a reply. So we're going to ask server, could you please give me all the list of messages to display in this message board? And that process will take time. Okay, you gotta connect to the server, and then the server is gonna do some work to ask the database, and eventually you're gonna get back a response. Now, how do we handle that wait? You know, I gotta wait. It's either gonna be accepted or not. So that's why I have promises in JavaScript. Okay, so a promise, you can create one if you say new promise like this. Okay, and then pass a function like this. And basically a promise, if you expand this, will have a state that's initially is going to be pending, meaning we're waiting, and eventually it's going to fulfill with some value, or it's going to be rejected with an error. So why promise? Promise basically, okay, when you create a promise, you're going to get something back, but as promised, but if you wait for it. So let's say I create a new promise here, and I'm going to give something back. Maybe I'm going to do the same technique of set timeout here, and after 3 seconds, I'm going to resolve with some value, hello. So when I do that, the promise will be pending for 3 seconds. Finally, after 3 seconds, we're going to resolve with some value there. And if you expand that, you're going to see the state's now fulfilled, which means, okay, the resolve function was called with a value hello. You can see the result here. All right. So why is this important? Because we're going to make a request to the server and we're going to get back a promise. So we have to learn how to handle the promise. After the promise is finished, how do we execute the instructions, but only after we receive a response. So let me copy this code again and then put in a variable called P, okay? So P is a promise, a variable. And the first time I use it, it's pending. The second time it's fulfilled with the value hello. So the promise from that we're gonna get from that request to the server will eventually be fulfilled. But how do we handle doing something after it's been fulfilled? We have to do p dot then, like this, and then you pass a function, and this function will receive as an argument or parameter here the value that was resolved. In this case, the hello message. We can say message here. And then you can do whatever with it. Maybe you want to console log that. We got the following from the promise, and then comma message. So basically I'm saying after the variable P it holds a promise. After the promise has been fulfilled, then I want to call the function that I pass. And since it was fulfilled with a value, that value is accessible through the message variable here. So you can do whatever. So it's going to console log. We got the following from the promise. We got hello here. Console log is just a function to print a message to the console here. Now, if the promise fails, you can reject. It gets rejected. So let me simulate a failure. Failure, if I go press up by keyboard, I'm going to redefine that promise. And I don't want to do the resolve. I want to reject the promise. Now, you reject usually with an error object. So you can say new error and some message for the error. Something went wrong. Something like that. Okay, so a promise is rejected with an error object. And I'm simulating that. And you can see right away that it's been rejected because I didn't put a timeout. So I probably should do that. Let me put a timeout for you to simulate that delay receiving the message from the server. So I put a timeout there. And then 3 seconds, which is 3,000 milliseconds. So initially it's pending, and then next time I see it, it's been rejected. You see that? State rejected, with the promised result being the error object. So how do I handle the error? You can say dot catch, for example, p dot catch. That's one way. And with the same way, the catch, you pass a function. In this case, it's going to receive the error as the argument. So you can do whatever with the error. You can, like, for example, unfortunately, the promise failed with the error, and then you can log the error dot message because an error object has a message property, so you can do that. And it's gonna say that, okay, because this promise, the P is a promise, it was rejected. Once a promise is rejected, it goes to the catch block and calls the function pass to catch. And this function console logs here my message with the error dot message. Okay, so that's promises. Now, in these days, you might also see async await. That's also another way of kind of handling promises in JavaScript. But yeah, let's keep going now and actually do the server side. So here in messages.js, under the useEffect function, I want to call the server to get the data. Now this server, I will use this website here called JSON placeholder dot typicode or typicode.com. And it's basically a fake backend server that we can use to test things. And it has a bunch of resources, and one of them is slash posts. And if I click that, I see like 100, I think. Let me pretty print this. Oh, it's already print. Basically, it gives you back a JSON response with an array of objects, and each represents like a fake post with many properties. Let me zoom in for you. For example, this first one has the property user ID, which is basically the ID of the user who posted this. I have an ID as identifier for the post, a title, which is the title of the post, and then the body here. Okay, so it repeats with the kind of same fake data and goes on and on. I think you can limit if you go here and say question mark underscore limit like 3, it can get just 3. So I'm going to use this endpoint. So I didn't talk much about how the apps these days retrieve data. So basically, we have the front end and then the back end. The front end is what people usually see, right? The website or the mobile application or the desktop application. And then that part, it makes, if when it needs to show you some data, it will ask some backend server. And the way they communicate is through usually HTTP protocol, hypertext transfer protocol. And then they exchange messages. And then in the body of that response that you receive, you can pass in some text. Now, that text can be formatted in a certain way. And the way people usually format it in the JSON, JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is this format we see here, which is basically a JavaScript object format. We have like objects and we have properties with quotation marks and then values. And the values could be like the JavaScript types, like number, can be strings, which has quotes. It can be true or false values. And it can even be another object in itself. Okay, so this is like the preferred way people, the apps interchange, communicate today. In the past, and still some legacy ones still do it, they use XML to do this. But JSON is much simpler, so that's the one that's popular today. In any case, so let's copy this. So how do you make a request to get data from a server? I also have to explain that. If you go to the browser and type this, press enter, that by default is an HP GET request. Now, how do you do that with JavaScript? Let me open the DevTools again. So there's this function called fetch that we can call to retrieve something. And you have to pass the URL of the resource or endpoint. In this case, it's the one here in the browser. So you can paste that under quotes and you press enter. And you see it returns back a promise. If I expand that, it's now fulfilled with a response object. And if I click that response, it has a bunch of properties. Now, this response object by itself, it has a body here, you can see. And if you click that, it's a readable stream. So it has to be kind of like parsed or extracted. And to do that, we have to handle the promise. Remember, to handle it, we have to use .then to do something after the promise has been fulfilled. And we're going to take the response and we're going to extract from the body the information. So if I do this, which returns a promise, I can do .then and then pass a function. And this function receives the response. Now, this response is what we saw here. We need to find a way to extract from the body. And to do that, there's several ways. And one of the easiest ways is to do response.json function like this. And then you return. Now, this JSON here, function of the response object, it will read the response and extract it and parse it in the JSON format. That way, you're gonna either get an array of or object in a promise that's fulfilled. So if you do that, you get yet another promise. And if you expand, it's been fulfilled with a result being an array of 3 things. And if you expand, here's the objects that correspond to what we saw in that response. So that's the first post, the second, and the third. Okay, so that's why you're going to see in the code, because it's a promise, the JSON function returns a promise again. You have to handle that. And the way we do that's with a chain of promises. So you can actually do another .then outside, which is basically mean, okay, this one returns a function, therefore when I say .then, it's going to handle the function. And then this one returns a promise, so we're going to handle that too with a .then outside. So repeat the same pattern, function with an argument. Now that argument is going to name it post or something because that's what it represents. Now the name inside the function arguments is arbitrary, but usually I choose something descriptive of what that really means, what the promise fulfills with. And then you can do whatever the post here. Maybe you can just let me console log the first post .title, right? It's an array. So post bracket sub 0, index 0 means first element. And then it's an object. And I can do .title to get the title. And you can see that it's been console logged, the title of the first post. Okay, I took the time to explain what promise is here so that we can finally jump into the code and understand, makes more sense. Because in the past, it was just jump in the code and write the promise right away, the fetch call right away, and people were kind of be confused. So I hope this helps a little bit. I know it might not make sense even if I expose you to it, but at least you got some exposure and eventually things just come into place. Okay, so we got the messages component. It's been rendered. The first time it's rendered, it's going to call the function provided to useEffect with the that has the dependency array empty. So we're going to go here, call fetch, because I want to retrieve data from a backend server. We're going to make an HTTP request. And by default, fetch uses the get method, okay? That's why I didn't say anything about get post. And provide that link, by the way, I pasted the Zoom chat. Okay, and then this returns a promise. Therefore, I must handle the promise, the value that was fulfilled, with a dot then, and pass a function. And this is a response always. Some common mistake people make when they use the fetch function is they don't realize that first returns a response object. So you got to be careful. And then from that response object, we got to extract the body as JSON. So we're going to return from the function a response.json like this. Now, something I didn't mention is, okay, what if something bad happens? What if the server doesn't give me back a good response? It rejects the promise. So you would, first you got to put a catch outside, and then you put a function with the error, and then do whatever to do error handling. Maybe you want to display an error message to the screen or something like that. Now, in this case, for the first fetch, a problem that could occur is maybe you're trying to get to the server, but you're offline. You don't have a network connection. That's one case where this first fetch here would throw an error, and then it would hit the catch block here. That's the first. Then if this actually succeeds, the next problem would occur is, what if I try to get a JSON from a response that doesn't actually has JSON? So that could also be the problem. So usually people, before doing that, check if response is actually okay. So this is error handling. Because there could be the case that maybe you're trying to, the server understands your ask a request, the server connected, but they don't know, maybe this endpoint or this URL doesn't actually point to any resource. So it could give back 404 status not found. In that case, what do you do here? Like, you have to check if a response is not okay, right? If it's okay, this means the status code was within the 2xx range, like 200 okay, 211 created, that kind of stuff. All right, and then let's assume happy path for now, meaning everything is fine. We're not going to get any errors. And then you actually have to handle this promise that's returned from this. So you have to add another then here outside with a function that will actually get the posts. So you see there's this chain of dot then and then dot catch. So be careful where you put them. You got to be outside this then here. Like if you were to ignore everything there, it has to be outside. Anyway, so once you finally get the post, you can set the messages like we did here. So you can take this part here, move it inside the then here, and let me remove the timeout. And then this is no longer hard-coded, right? This would have to be posts, but there's a catch. My messages objects expects a message property here. However, I don't think they use message, right? They use title or body, if you recall. In their objects has title and body. So we either have to change our code, or we could just parse that and follow our own by mapping to new objects. So whichever. If you were to change our code here, If you just leave it as it is, we would go down here, and where we do the message, you have to change that to what? Title or body, right? I'm using title for now. So if you have dot message somewhere, has to be dot title. Now, if you didn't want to do this, you would leave it as message. You have to go here, map your responses. You would do post.map, and then you're going to take the post, and you're going to return a new object that pretty much copies from post and introduces the message property. That's basically post.title. That's the other way. Okay, I'm going to copy this. I prefer the short way for now, which makes more sense to me. So I'm going to revert, but I paste the code to the Zoom chat. Okay. Makes more sense, right? Title, a body, so on. Let me see what I had before. Just set messages with posts. And here in the mapping, I do dot title. Okay, let's check it out. Now it's working. If I refresh again, yeah. Yeah, it's so fast that you barely notice, but I notice initially it's blank, and then momentarily it fetches all the stuff. The promise is fulfilled, and then it goes to response.json to extract, and then the other promise is fulfilled. And then finally you got the post, you call set messages with that array of posts. And because you change the state, React re-renders the component, and the DOM here, the document object model, is updated due to React doing its lifting for us behind the scenes. Okay. So usually when we have data retrieval, like I said, there's the loading state and the error. So let's try to simulate some error. So let's go here. Let's say I'm offline. Something happens. Let's show you how to do that. So in Google Chrome, for example, or Firefox, it's kind of the same. Press the DevTools, network, and I can click here, no throttling. I can actually do offline, which will make me act as though I'm offline. I don't have a network connection. So if I do that and refresh, no internet. You see that? It doesn't even reach the server. So, but let me try to simulate. I have the app running, and then I somehow cut my connection. So to do that, I put no throttling. I have to go to sources. I put a breakpoint. Let me do, what is it? Messages? Yes, right? Let me first refresh here. Oops. Refresh. And then sources, message.js. I'm going to do a breakpoint here in the useEffect right at the line for fetch. So when I'm about to fetch, I'm going to make myself offline. So let's try. If I refresh, I'm not fetched yet, but I'm going to go to network, click offline for throttling. And then I'm going to go back to sources, and I'm going to let it through to the next. I'm going to let it play. Let's see what happened there. See another. Yeah. So we see in the console, we get an error, internet disconnected. But from the point of view like of the user using the app, they have no idea what happened. You just see blank where the message is supposed to be. So we need to improve this with some error message there for it, at least, right? So let's do that. So we're gonna go here, maybe before the list. I'm gonna add an error here message in a div. Now I need to store that somewhere, so I'm gonna make a variable in the state for that. Let's call it posts error. How about that? So I only want to show this if this variable has something defined. So I can use this technique of short circuiting like this. Basically, this is this and that. So if the left-hand side is defined, in this case, it's going to be a string or a sequence of characters. If that has at least one character, the right-hand side will be checked, and will show the div. If this is something like not defined or an empty string, sorry, it will not go and do the right-hand side. It will instead short circuit and just return the value for post error as either empty or not undefined, not defined, in which case React takes that as something that you don't want to show anything at all. Let's define it here up in the where we do our state stuff. I'm going to do a use state. And I can either do null or defined or empty string. It doesn't really matter because in JavaScript, an empty string is considered a falsy value. But if you want to be really like strict, you can put null there to be more clear. If you want to use it like this, like I was telling you about, you can do use state here like that. That way you don't have to type React dot. And because this is a use state call to the hook, it returns an array of 2 elements. So we do structure to extract the first element and the second. Let's extract the first element, oops, equal sign here, into post error. And then the second element will be set post error. That's the mutate function to change the value post error. Okay, so here we use effect. If we fetch and we fail the fetch because we're not connected to the internet, it will jump to the catch and execute these instructions here. So in the catch, you can set the post error to the error.message. That way, when you do this, you update the state for post error. React will re-render this component, and ultimately, because post error here will be like some sort of error, like internet disconnected or something, this is defined, like has at least one character. It's a true the value of JavaScript, therefore it's considered true. So the right-hand side of the AND logic will be returned. Okay, if you want to look this up, it's logical and. Okay, you can look at the truth table for that. So for and, most has to be true to return a true value. Anyway, let's try again. So how do I do that again? We got to go back to no throttling. And I'm going to put the breakpoint, refresh. We're paused at the breakpoint. I'm going to make myself offline. I'm going to go to sources, play. And I see the error message there. At least that we got now. The user will know, oh, okay, failed to fetch. Something is wrong. Okay, now let's do the loading state. Let me remove the breakpoint here and make myself online again. Mind you, there could be more errors, right? Maybe the server returned 404. So for that, you would have to check here in this one. Maybe you could try something like, if not okay, you can do throw new error with the response. I think you can access the status text or something. Can't recall. You have to use the dev tools. But anyway, I'll put ... something here. And because if you do this throw here, throw will basically raise an error and will jump right to the catch block. Therefore, it will set the post error. So that's one way. But let's handle the loading state. So how do people show that spinner or at least a loading message? So let's use state here to create a loading state that's initially true. Equal sign const post loading. Let's call it that, set post loading. So basically, I want to keep track of a Boolean value that's either true or false that will represent whether the posts are loading. So initially, they're loading, so I put initial value true there. So we got the useEffect here. So we got the fetch. And once we set the message posts, that means we have finished loading. So after that, we can call to set post loading to false, right? It's no longer loading. But also you have to keep in mind, what if there's an error? That also means I'm no longer loading. So you have to do the same thing after set post error. So there's that. And usually, if you have a mechanism that you can always retrieve data multiple times throughout the lifetime of the app running, you could actually make your, in the beginning, set post loading to true. To initially, okay, if I submit a form, for example, I set loading to true, do all my stuff, and at the end I set to false. But in this case, I don't need it because it's just executing once. Okay, now we got to show that message or a spinner if you have an icon. Maybe we can try something like here next to the error, you can add either before or after, doesn't matter. If your post loading, you can follow the same technique, short circuit. If that is true, then the right-hand side will be returned. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. We can show like loading div or a spinner or whatever. Maybe you can leverage font awesome and put a spinner there, or create your own animation CSS or image or whatever. Just keep it simple. Now, this is going to be hard to detect. So we have to put a timeout there to simulate the delay, exaggerate, but let's see. I see loading momentarily. Let me try to throttle my connection. If I make my connection like slow for or 3G, it's like slow. Let's see what we got. It's really slow, kind of slow, loading, 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 loading. Okay, that one's a little better. But if you want to really see loading all the time, just put a timeout in your useEffect function body, and it should simulate a very long delay. All right, I think everybody saw the loading there. So it's gone once we set the loading back to false. Okay, let's try something to finish off, simulate a fake submission, because right now we do hello and just not calling the backend. So if you recall, we have the text area and it's under a form. So when I click write message, it calls the function from the onSubmit handler, which is add message. And typically what we do here is we want to first call the backend server. So we make a fetch to that very same fake one. Oops. Except you have to do a post request. So you do a fetch to the same kind of address without the question mark. But it has to be a post, not yet. So how to change that? Well, the second argument to fetch can be an object of options. And one of the options is a method. You can put post like this as string. Remember, object, property, colon, value. The value is a string, so it has quotes. And a comma to separate other property value pairs. And also want to change some things because I need to provide, okay, you're sending us a new post, right? So give us the title, the body, and so on and so on. So that's the body property. Now the body here, you have to take what? Remember, we have new message, right? So we have an object. So we can take this one and put it here, but it doesn't call, it's not called message, it's title or body or whatever, right? Body and other, possibly others, right? So I'm going to comment these. By the way, a comment in JavaScript, basically it's ignores, the computer ignores everything after the slash slash. So this is actually, you can imagine the computer doesn't even look at that, at these two. It will just see that. Okay, so I'm passing the body, but I have to do something. It's called make this JavaScript object a string in plain text. To do that, we call the JSON here dot string efi and pass that object. So this will take this object convert to a string. Let me show you in the DevTools if you're confused about that. So you have an object, right? Title, hello world. This is an object, right? Type of object is object. Now, need to convert that to text, plain text, to send in my request. So I can do JSON stringify obj, and I get a string, which is basically a sequence of characters, just like this in JSON format. So that's what it's doing, right? Type of this, type of that string. All right, so we got to do that here. Don't forget. Okay, now we got to also let the server know, hey, we're sending you some data and the format is JSON. It's plain text, but it could be plain text or JSON, right? It's text, but it could be plain or JSON. So we need to pass some HTTP headers to let the server know. So we can pass headers through the headers property. And that header is called content-type. But because it has a dash, we got to do some quotes here surrounding the name of the property. And then you can say for the value application /JSON. This is a standard naming name for that. It has to be that way. Okay, let's see. And that will make the post. And that whole thing returned a promise. So what do we do to handle a fulfilled promise? We got a dot then. Yes. And that returns returns a promise, right? That fulfills of a response object. So we got to do that same thing over and over again. If response, let's just make it simple like this. Not okay. The status code is not within 200. I'm going to throw a new error. Fail to submit post. And I think we can maybe investigate that in DevTools. And then if not, we keep going. If this is not the case, the response is okay, it keeps going. This is an if statement, by the way. Let me refresh your memory. So if statement is if the condition within parentheses is true, execute what's between the curly braces. So response is an object that has a property okay, that'll be true or false. If the response went well, it will be true. So when you have true here and you put the bang before that, it flips that to false. So it flips to false. And if it's false, it doesn't execute the body. Okay. And after that, just keeps going like that. If it were true, right, response were not okay, that's false. False gets converted to true. Therefore, it executes this throw. Because you throw, it just skips everything afterwards and go to the catch block, which we got to put here outside. And you're going to handle the error, right? Handle the error. Maybe set a state message. For now, just put console error to do. And finally, a response JSON here, same thing. And then if you want to extract anything from the response, right? If you care, maybe usually you receive the object back with an ID so that you can set the ID. So that's something you could do. So dot then function created post, let's call it that. And we can update the messages. We're gonna copy all the messages, but we're gonna add at the top the created post like this. That way it's gonna include the ID. And by the way, this has to be not response. Okay, I'll revert that back. Okay, let's see if no problems. I'll debug with DevTools to let you know what's going on. Okay, we're here. We'll go to sources. Oops, let me put it back network to no throttling. Otherwise, it's too slow. Sources, I want to go here and message.js on add message. I want to put a breakpoint here and here. Okay, I put a breakpoint right after we fulfill the first promise, and then after we fulfill the second. Now let's try hello, write message. So if you click network, it's gonna see here we made a post request. You gotta click XHR fetch if you want to narrow down. It's the third one with the post. See, the post was here. Here's the payload, which is the title hello. If you click source, it's just a string. And headers, if you scroll down here, my request headers includes content type application JSON, which is what we set under the headers object. Okay, and then going back to sources, if you want to look at the response, the status was 201, which is basically created, and there's no text. And yeah, it's okay. If you hover over okay, it's true. Okay, this is basically checking if the status is within the 200 range, because 200 usually means everything went well. And if it's outside 200, like 300 something, 400 something, 500 something, something wrong happened usually. And we can just go and to the next line, and you see it skips the throw. It doesn't do that. And then you can click play to go to the next one. And you can see here, it gives you back the post that was created with the ID, which is usually what happens when you have an actual server. And once you create the post with the title hello, it gives you back the identifier for that post in the database. And we're going to set messages here. Let's see what we got. I got hello at the top. So it's there. So you could try again. And it's going always to the top. Always preserving the previous, putting it at the top. Okay. Now let's go back here. Let me just finish off simulating something bad happening. Maybe you failed to submit the post. You can follow the same pattern. So you create a new variable here. You can call it, for example, submission error, set submission error, and use state. Initially, it could be no error. And then in the view here for the return, maybe under the text area here, after the button, you can put it if there's a submission error and short circuit with a div with the error. Failed to submit post. Here's the error message, submission error. And close the div. But if you recall, the curly brace is needed when you need to actually substitute the value of this variable. If you don't have the curly brace, it will literally show the word submission error and not the value that it points to as a variable. And then to set that error, you can go here to the add message, write fetch, then catch, and you would do the set submission error with the error dot message there. Okay, I can simulate that for you by doing a throw. Here in the second fulfillment, I can simulate by saying like throw new error, couldn't create the post for some reason. Actually, here or there, doesn't matter. Let's put it here. How about that? Let me run this. So if you try to submit, it would just fail here. The other thing is appearing, by the way, because I didn't fix this part here. We have to remove that. So let me remove this here. And we have to clear that only when it's successful, right? So we move that to after we create here. That way it fixes that problem that we had. So if you go back, let me refresh. I write message, failed to submit. So that's what you see. Obviously, you make it better, make it like a red banner or something, make it fancier. But anyway, I'm gonna remove that because we don't want that. It was just a simulation of the error. So line 51 removed. So if this one were to happen, it would actually do that. Uh, and I didn't put the message here. If the backend included some response, you have to put here after the colon. But anyway, that's it from that. And I think this lecture, we're gonna call it a day.